Dr. Samuel Alcott's medical bag struck his knee with each stride across the frozen furrows of the Whitmore farm. The leather case, carrying the instruments of a profession that had until this February afternoon provided reliable explanations for most human ailments. The message from Thomas Whitmore had been typically terse. Boy won't wake. Third day now. Come. The farmhouse kitchen held the particular stillness of a household disrupted. Breakfast dishes abandoned on the pine table, coffee grown cold in tin cups, the fire in the cook stove burning low. Martha Whitmore didn't rise from her chair, pulled close to the narrow bed they'd moved near the heat. Her fingers worked steadily at her knitting. Though Alcott noticed she'd been working the same row for some time, the yarn tangled. Started Tuesday, Thomas said without preamble. Came in from splitting wood, said he was tired. Laid down there. He gestured to the bed where his son rested. 12 years old, according to Alcott's records, small for his age, but previously robust. Haven't moved since. Alcott set his bag on the table, noting the boy's position hadn't shifted from what might have been a natural settling into sleep. Right arm tucked beneath the pillow, left hand curled against his chest, legs drawn up slightly. The quilt rose and fell with mechanical precision. When Alcott pressed 2 fingers to the boy's wrist, the pulse beat steady and strong, 68 beats by his pocket watch, temperature normal by touch. Pupils, when he lifted the lids, contracted appropriately to the lamp Martha held close. Elias, Alcott said firmly, then louder. Elias Whitmore. Nothing. He withdrew his percussion hammer, tapped below the knee. The leg jumped satisfactorily. Pinpricks to the sole of the foot produced no withdrawal, though the reflexes remained intact. From his bag came the vial of ammonia salts he'd used successfully on countless fainted women and swooning men. He waved it beneath the boy's nose until Martha's eyes watered from across the room. The child might have been carved from warm wax. Has he taken water? Broth? Alcott asked, though he suspected the answer. We've tried. Martha's needles clicked faster. Thomas held his mouth open while I spooned in beef tea. It just pooled there. Had to turn him so he wouldn't choke. Alcott made his first entry in his ledger, dating it February 15th, 1852. Patient E. Whitmore, age 12 years, third day of unresponsive state. Vital signs within normal ranges, reflexes intact, no response to standard stimuli. Nervous exhaustion probable. Similar cases documented in mill workers, though unusual in children. Recommend continued attempts at feeding, application of cold compressors. He prescribed what he could. Mustard plasters, cold water baths, spirits of hartshorn, knowing even as he wrote the instructions that Thomas's skeptical expression reflected his own doubts. Still, medicine was often a matter of time and patience. The body, particularly a young body, possessed remarkable capacities for self-correction. I'll return tomorrow, Alcott promised, latching his bag. Through the window, he noticed the Whitmores' 2 milk cows standing peculiarly still in the barn doorway, their breath steaming in the cold air, both facing the house. These cases of nervous collapse typically resolve within the week. Martha's knitting needles stopped. And if it doesn't? Then we'll consider other approaches. Alcott kept his voice measured, professional. The Medical College in Chicago has new texts on disorders of the nervous system. Treatments advance constantly. That night, Alcott reviewed his library's slim offerings on catatonia and hysteria, finding little that matched the boy's presentation. He prepared additional interventions, electrical stimulation from his voltaic apparatus, subcutaneous injections of strychnine in minute doses, even the controversial technique of submersion in ice water that a colleague in Boston had reported successful in rousing a woman from a 3-day stupor. By the third morning, when even burning sulfur beneath the boy's nose produced no response, Alcott began a new page in his ledger. Alcott's voltaic apparatus occupied most of the kitchen table, its copper and zinc plates submerged in dilute sulfuric acid, the acrid smell mixing with the perpetual coffee and wood smoke of the Whitmore farmhouse. 3 weeks had passed since his first examination, and the March thaw had turned the yard to mud that clung to his boots with each visit. "Hold his arm steady," Alcott instructed Thomas, who gripped his son's wrist with the careful force of a man afraid to hurt but desperate to help. The connecting wires, insulated with India rubber, terminated in copper terminals that Alcott pressed against Elias's temples. When he completed the circuit, the boy's facial muscles contracted slightly. A mechanical response, nothing more. Martha had stopped her knitting entirely, instead filling a cloth-bound journal with her small, precise script. She recorded everything: the times Alcott arrived and departed, the procedures attempted, the unchanging rhythm of Elias's breathing. The mantel clock behind her ticked through another hour. "The Reverend Pike came yesterday," she said, not looking up from her writing. "Organized a prayer circle. Mrs. Henderson claimed she saw the boy's soul wandering near Miller's Pond." Thomas released his son's arm, the skin unmarked despite the electrical current. "Fool women and their gossip. They mean well." Martha's pen scratched across the page. "Though I told them to pray quietly. Elias needs rest, not commotion." Alcott disconnected his apparatus, making his own notes. The electrical stimulation had produced the same null result as the subcutaneous injections of strychnine, 1/60th of a grain, carefully measured. The ice baths that had turned the boy's lips blue and raised gooseflesh across his thin chest, the forced feeding through rubber tubes that Martha had finally refused to watch. The boy's body accepted nourishment: sugar water, beef tea, milk, but showed no signs of true consciousness. "There's a man coming through Peoria next week," Thomas said, studying the wall rather than meeting Alcott's eyes. "Travels with a medicine show. He's offered—" He stopped, jaw working. "He's offered $50 to display Elias as a medical curiosity." The room fell silent, except for the clock and the soft whistle of Elias's breathing. "I told him no," Thomas continued, "but $50. "You did right," Alcott said firmly. "Your son is a patient, not a specimen for public entertainment." Through the window, he noticed the Henley girl approaching across the muddy yard, primer clutched against her chest. 10 years old, according to Martha, and uncommonly devoted to her visits. She entered without knocking. The Whitmores had stopped observing such formalities and took her place on the stool beside Elias's bed. "Good afternoon, Elias," Nora said, opening her book. "Today, we're reading about the Romans." She read in a clear, steady voice while Alcott packed his instruments. He'd begun to notice patterns in his failures. The boy's pulse quickened slightly during thunderstorms, but returned to baseline within minutes. His skin flushed when the room grew too warm, but showed no other response to temperature. These were autonomic functions, the body maintaining itself without the mind's participation. Reverend Pike arrived as Alcott prepared to leave, his black coat still damp from the earlier rain. "Doctor, any improvement?" "The patient remains stable." "Stable." Pike repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "The congregation wonders if this might be a test, like Job. Or perhaps—" He glanced at Martha, lowered his voice, "a punishment." "It's a medical condition," Alcott said sharply. "Nothing more, nothing less." That evening, he returned unexpectedly, having forgotten his percussion hammer. The house stood dark except for a single lamp in the kitchen. Martha sat beside Elias's bed, her journal open, speaking in a low murmur. She startled when Alcott entered. "I was just—" She closed the journal quickly. "Sometimes I tell him about the day, the calves being born, the new roses I've planned for spring." Alcott retrieved his hammer, then paused. Something glistened on Elias's cheek. He stepped closer, held the lamp high. A single tear had traced a path from the boy's closed left eye, pooling in the hollow above his jaw. "When did this happen?" Martha stood slowly, her hands trembling. "Just now, while I was talking." She touched the tear with her fingertip, as if confirming its reality. "He knows. He knows we're here." Martha's journal for that night reads simply, "He wept. He knows we are here." Alcott trimmed the boy's fingernails with surgical scissors, collecting the parings in a small envelope marked E.W., June 1854. 2 years and 4 months since the sleep began, and these quarterly maintenance visits had assumed the character of ritual. Martha no longer watched these procedures, instead maintaining her journals, 7 volumes now, at the kitchen table, where she could still see her son. "His beard's coming in," Thomas observed from the doorway, having abandoned his pretense of normal farm work during Alcott's visits. The soft down on Elias's jaw had indeed darkened, though patchily, as if the body couldn't quite commit to full maturation while the mind remained absent. 14 years old now, Alcott noted in his ledger, measuring the boy's height with his tape. 5 feet, 4 inches. Growth rate consistent with normal development, though muscle tone remains poor despite Martha's daily manipulation of the limbs. Through the window, he could see men in the south field driving wooden stakes into the ground, their hammering carrying across the June afternoon. A surveying team from the Illinois Central Railroad Company had arrived the previous week, marking the proposed route that would connect Chicago to Cairo. "Progress," Thomas said, following Alcott's gaze. "They say the rails will bring prosperity." "And noise," Martha added without looking up from her writing. Elias always preferred quiet. The Henley girl arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as had become her custom. 14 now herself, Nora had advanced from her primer to Scott's Ivanhoe, which she read in carefully modulated tones while Martha documented every detail: the angle of afternoon light on Elias's face, the 23 breaths per minute, the way his eyelids occasionally flickered during thunderstorms. "Doctor, look at this." Martha brought one of her earlier journals, opened to an entry from the previous September. Her neat script recorded 3:17 in the morning. Tear from left eye. No storm, no disturbance. She flipped forward several pages. October 15th, 3:17 in the morning. Single tear. Another flip. November 2nd, 3:17. Alcott finished, studying the entries. Always the left eye? Always. He made his own notation, though privately wondered if Martha's vigilance had crossed into obsession. Still, the precision of the timing troubled him. Nature rarely operated with such mechanical regularity. The railroad surveyor's foreman, a sun-weathered man named Mitchell, had stopped by earlier to discuss easements with Thomas. He'd glanced at Elias and mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd heard of something similar in Pennsylvania. A girl who'd slept through an entire winter, waking only when the spring thaw came. "And she recovered fully?" Alcott had asked. "Couldn't say. We moved on to the next survey." Mitchell had paused at the door. "Though I heard she never spoke again. Not a word." Now, as Alcott completed his examination, he noticed Martha adding a new annotation to her current entry, something in the margin, written smaller than her usual script. She caught him looking and closed the journal. "Private thoughts," she said simply. The mantel clock chimed 4. Nora closed her book, touched Elias's hand briefly, a gesture that had become her farewell, and departed. In the sudden quiet, Alcott became aware of a sound he hadn't noticed before, a rhythmic creaking from the attic above. "Mice," Thomas said quickly. "I'll set traps." But the rhythm was too regular for rodents, too measured, like someone rocking in a chair, except the attic had been closed since winter. "His color rises during hymns," Martha said, redirecting attention to her son. "Every Sunday when I sing, 'Shall we gather at the river?' his cheeks flush pink. And during thunderstorms, his fingers move, just slightly, like he's trying to grasp something." Alcott examined the boy's hands. The fingers lay precisely as he'd positioned them after trimming the nails, but Martha's journals recorded dozens of these supposed movements, always at the edge of perception, never quite confirmable. Outside, the surveying crew packed their equipment. Mitchell called out that they'd return in autumn to mark the final route. The rails would pass within 2 miles of the Whitmore farm, close enough to hear the whistle, far enough to avoid the smoke. That Christmas, Alcott discovered Martha had been recording the exact times of each tier, always 3:17 in the morning. The precision of Martha's recording, always 3:17 in the morning, occupied Alcott's thoughts as he greeted the 2 specialists from Rush Medical College on a humid August morning in 1857. Dr. Whitman and Dr. Frost arrived with enough apparatus to stock a small hospital. Galvanometers for measuring electrical activity, barometers, thermometers, and a curious device with copper coils they claimed could detect magnetic anomalies in living tissue. 5 years of uninterrupted catatonia, Whitman said, circling Elias's bed while Frost assembled their instruments. "Remarkable. The longest case in our records lasted 14 months. The boy, though at 17, Alcott supposed he should call him a young man, had developed the angular features of approaching adulthood. His siblings had married and moved to the new railroad towns springing up along the completed track. Only Nora Henley maintained her visits, now reading from Dickens in a voice that had lost its childish pitch. "Temperature in the room, 72 degrees, Frost announced, recording measurements with methodical precision. Barometric pressure, 29.92 inches. Pulse, 64. Respiration, 20 inches. He positioned his compass near Elias's head, watched the needle swing. Northwest deviation of 12 degrees. "That's not possible," Whitman said, checking the compass himself. "The deviation should be consistent with—" He stopped, adjusted his spectacles, moved the compass to Elias's chest. The needle swung southeast. Alcott watched them work through the afternoon, noting how they avoided meeting each other's eyes as their measurements grew increasingly erratic. The galvanometer registered electrical pulses that shouldn't exist in unconscious tissue. The barometer showed pressure variations in a 3-foot radius around the bed, as if Elias existed in his own private weather system. "Eastern monks," Whitman muttered, consulting a leather journal filled with cramped notes. "There are accounts of suspended animation achieved through meditation. The heart rate slows to almost nothing. The body enters a state between life and death." "This boy wasn't meditating," Thomas said from the doorway. He'd grown thinner these past years, the farm struggling without his son's help. He was stacking wood. Martha brought tea, her movements automatic from years of practice. 23 journals now lined the shelf above Elias's bed, each one meticulously dated and numbered. Alcott noticed she no longer looked directly at her son, instead focusing on peripheral tasks. adjusting blankets, trimming lamp wicks, recording observations. "We'll need to conduct tests through the night," Frost said. "The magnetic variations might follow a pattern tied to celestial positions." They worked until past midnight, filling pages with numbers that refused to form coherent patterns. At one point, Whitman attempted to photograph Elias using the new collodion process, but the plates showed only blurred shadows where the boy should have been, as if he wouldn't hold still for the extended exposure, despite his perfect immobility. "Have you considered," Whitman said carefully, "that this might be beyond the scope of medical science?" "Everything has a scientific explanation," Alcott replied, though the words felt hollow. "We simply haven't found it yet." The next morning, the specialists packed their equipment in silence. Whitman handed Alcott a card for a colleague in Boston who studied anomalous consciousness, but his expression suggested little hope. "We'll publish our findings," Frost said, though both Alcott and he knew this was unlikely. The medical establishment had little patience for impossible cases. After they left, Alcott stopped at Miller's boarding house to collect a book he'd lent the proprietor. On the desk in the room the specialists had shared, he found their notes, pages of measurements, calculations, diagrams of the magnetic anomalies. Across the final page, in Whitman's precise script, was written a single word: impossible. Alcott folded the papers carefully, adding them to his own growing collection of inadequate explanations. Through the boarding house window, he could see the railroad depot in the distance, smoke from the morning train rising like a question mark against the sky. The whistle sounded, a long, mournful note that seemed to echo off something that wasn't there. That evening, returning to check on Elias one final time, Alcott found Martha in the kitchen, adding another entry to her journal. She'd drawn something in the margin, a clock face with both hands pointing to 3:17. "The tears still come," she said without looking up. "Every time, exactly then." Alcott found their abandoned notes in the boarding house, covered with a single word: impossible. The impossible notation from the Chicago specialists haunted Alcott through the war years, when his visits to the Whitmore farm became irregular, interrupted by militia musters and medical emergencies from the battlefields. By October 1865, with Thomas still absent, his last letter arriving 3 months prior from somewhere in Tennessee, Alcott found Martha alone, with her burden of documentation. 43 journals now filled 2 shelves, their spines numbered in her precise hand. The new railroad terminal, operational since spring, sent its bells tolling across the 2 miles of prairie every hour, and with each chime, Martha made a mark in her current volume. "He responds to them," she said, showing Alcott her latest pages. "Watch his eyelids when the 3 o'clock bell sounds." They waited. The distant bell rang, and indeed, Elias's eyelids fluttered. 3 distinct movements, matching the bell count. "And look here." Martha pulled down journal number 15, dated 1859. "I started recording his color changes. They follow the lunar month exactly. Fuller at the new moon, paler at the full." She turned more pages. "And the tears, they stopped coming at 3:17 for 6 months in 1862, then resume." Alcott examined the patterns she'd mapped. Train whistles correlated with finger movements. Thunder produced changes in breathing rhythm. But most unsettling were the marginal notes, written in smaller script, as if Martha was documenting secrets. "What are these annotations?" he asked, pointing to the cramped writing beside certain entries. Martha hesitated, then retrieved a separate journal from beneath her mattress, unmarked, unlike the others. I didn't want to mix these with the observations. They're dreams, things Elias tells me when I sleep. Alcott's medical training recoiled from such fancy, but Martha's eyes held no madness, only exhaustion. He describes places, she continued, opening the unmarked journal. A great building made of iron and glass, taller than anything in Chicago. Carriages that move without horses. Battles with weapons that kill from miles away. She found a specific entry. This one, from May 1853. He told me about a train station here, with a clock tower and 5 platforms. I drew it as he described. The sketch showed a building remarkably similar to the terminal that now stood 2 miles south, though Martha had drawn it 3 years before the railroad company had even surveyed the route. Coincidence, Alcott said, though the word felt inadequate. Is it? Martha turned to another page. September 1861. He told me about Thomas falling from a horse, breaking his left arm. The letter confirming it arrived 2 weeks later. Nora Henley arrived for her daily reading. Now a woman of 23, her own childhood suspended in this vigil. She'd never married, despite several suitors, claiming she couldn't abandon her promise to read to Elias. His lips moved sometimes, Nora mentioned, as she settled with her book. During certain passages, Shakespeare especially, his mouth shapes the words, along with me. Alcott observed carefully as Nora read from Hamlet. Indeed, during the to-be or not-to-be soliloquy, Elias's lips parted slightly, the faintest suggestion of language without sound. That evening, as Alcott prepared to leave, Martha showed him one final entry from her dream journal. Last Tuesday, she said, he told me you would find the word impossible written by the Chicago doctors. He said you would come today, specifically today, and that you would finally believe. Alcott's hands grew cold. He hadn't told anyone about finding that notation. There's more, Martha said, her voice dropping. He says he's learning something wherever he is. Something about time not being what we think. About how certain moments— She paused, struggling for words, how they echo forward and backward, both. The terminal bells rang the hour. 6 o'clock. Elias's eyelids fluttered 6 times, then stilled. He knows when he'll wake, Martha said quietly. April 17th, 1872, at 3:17 in the morning. He's told me this since 1858. Alcott recorded none of this in his official ledger, instead making private notes he would later consider burning. The rational frameworks of medicine had no place for prophetic dreams or impossible knowledge. Yet the evidence accumulated like snow against a door, silent and undeniable. Doctor, she said, showing him an entry from 1853, he told me about the rail station 3 years before they built it. Martha's prophecy from 1858, that Elias would wake on April 17th, 1872, at 3:17 in the morning, had lodged in Alcott's mind like a splinter. He'd missed the evening train back to town, the new locomotive breaking down 3 miles outside the station, and so found himself at the Whitmore farm near midnight, accepting Martha's offer of the settee, rather than walking home in darkness. The mantel clock showed 3:15. Alcott sat in the kitchen chair he'd occupied for 20 years of examinations, his medical bag at his feet, watching the sleeping form that had grown from boy to man in perfect stillness. Thomas, returned from the war with his left arm weakened but intact, stood by the window. Martha sat on her usual stool, her 60-second journal closed in her lap. She'd stopped writing the previous week, claiming there was nothing left to record. 3:16. Nora Henley had arrived an hour earlier, unable to sleep. Now 30, she clutched the same book of Shakespeare she'd been reading aloud for the past month, her fingers white against the binding. 3:17. The clock began its chime. On the first note, Elias's eyelids fluttered, not the mechanical response to the bells they'd observed for years, but something deliberate, struggling. On the second note, his fingers curled. On the third, his eyes opened. Alcott's hand moved automatically to his pocket watch, confirming the time while his mind reeled. The pupils contracted normally after 20 years of dilation. The boy's, man's, chest rose in a deep, conscious breath. "Water," Elias said, his voice cracking like dried leather. The pitch belonged to childhood, but emerged from a throat that had deepened without use. Martha's hand trembled as she brought a cup to his lips. He drank slowly, eyes moving around the room with the confusion of someone waking from an afternoon nap to find it midnight. "Why is it so dark?" he asked. "And cold?" It was just past noon. "Elias," Alcott said carefully, moving closer to observe the returning animation in the man's features. "What do you remember?" "I was stacking wood. February. Got tired." He tried to sit up, looked at his hands. Man's hands, work rough and large. His eyes widened. "What? Whose hands are these?" Thomas stepped forward. "Son, it's 1872. "That's not—" Elias stopped, stared at his father's grayed hair, the lines carved deep by war and worry. His gaze shifted to his mother, 20 years older, to Nora, no longer a child. "No, I just laid down for a moment. I was just resting." Alcott documented with shaking hands, pulse accelerating from 64 to 96, temperature rising from 96.8 to 98.6 degrees within minutes. All reflexes not just intact, but hyperactive, as if the nervous system was remembering how to function. "My slingshot," Elias said suddenly. "I left it by the woodpile." Martha made a sound, half laugh, half sob. She retrieved the small forked branch with its rubber strips from a drawer, preserved like a relic. Elias took it with his unfamiliar hands, turned it over with the wonder of a child, examining an artifact from another life. "There's a sound," he said, head tilting, "like a whistle, but not any bird I know." "The train," Thomas said quietly. "The railroad runs 2 miles south now." "Railroad?" Elias's confusion deepened. "But the nearest tracks are in Springfield. That's 40 miles. Alcott continued his examination, muscle tone poor but improving by the minute. Cognitive function intact, but temporally displaced. He spoke of events from 1852 as if they'd happened hours ago. When asked about the years between, he had no answers, no memories, no dreams to report, just a sense of having closed his eyes for a moment's rest. "The chores," Elias said, trying to stand on legs that buckled. "The cows need milking." "We sold the cows," Thomas said, 10 years ago. The young man, in an adult body, looked around the kitchen. The same room but subtly changed. New stove, different curtains. His bed moved to where the butter churn once stood. His face crumpled with a grief that had no words, the loss of 20 years hitting him like a physical blow. When told the year, the boy man studied his own enlarged hands and whispered, "But I was only resting a moment." Part 7. The institutional silence. The whispered confession, "But I was only resting a moment," echoed through the weeks that followed, as Elias struggled to inhabit a body 20 years older than his mind expected. Alcott watched him at the rail yard where Thomas had secured him work, light duties, sorting mail and freight, and noticed how he would pause mid-task, staring at nothing, or perhaps at everything that had changed. The War Department investigators arrived in July, 3 men in dark suits who examined Elias with the dispassion of botanists cataloging a specimen. They measured skull dimensions, tested reflexes, asked questions about Confederate sympathizers in the area. Alcott provided only his clinical observations, the bare facts stripped of context, dates, vital signs, physical development. Nothing about Martha's dreams or the prophetic awakening time. 20 years of complete catatonia with no brain damage, the lead investigator said, reviewing Alcott's ledger. Impossible. That word again. Alcott said nothing. The Chicago Tribune sent a reporter who offered the family $500 for exclusive rights to the story. Thomas refused. The Medical Society of Illinois requested a full presentation with the patient present for examination. Alcott declined on the family's behalf. Scientists from Harvard wrote requesting tissue samples, hair, blood, anything that might explain the phenomenon. All letters went unanswered. In his office one evening, Alcott fed his speculative notes to the fire. Pages where he'd attempted to reconcile Martha's prophetic dreams with medical science, where he'd documented the magnetic anomalies and temporal impossibilities. He kept only the clinical record, dry as dust, suitable for any medical archive that would never quite believe it. Martha visited him in September, carrying a cloth bundle. "I wanted you to have these," she said, placing 42 journals on his desk, all except one. "The dreams?" She nodded. "Those weren't for science. They were between my boy and me." Alcott noticed she still called him my boy, though Elias now stood 6 feet tall, his hands calloused from rail yard work, his face weathered by sun and the peculiar grief of lost time. "He remembers things sometimes," Martha added quietly. "Not the sleeping years, but fragments. He told me yesterday about a great war that will come, worse than the one we just finished, weapons that can destroy entire cities. He says he doesn't know how he knows." Through the window, Alcott could see Elias at the depot platform, arranging mail sacks. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone relearning their body, but occasionally Alcott caught him tilting his head, as if listening to something just beyond hearing, perhaps the echo of wherever he'd been for 20 years. 3 letters arrived that autumn, from families in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Connecticut, describing similar cases. Children who wouldn't wake, aging in sleep while their minds remained absent. Alcott wrote back with clinical suggestions, avoiding any mention of dreams or prophecies or the precise time of 3:17. Reverend Pike delivered a sermon declaring the awakening a miracle, proof of divine intervention. The congregation nodded and praised God, then whispered afterward about witchcraft and deals with devils. The town, like the medical establishment, preferred its mysteries explained or ignored. By winter, Elias had learned to move through his days with a kind of practiced normalcy. He worked, ate, slept. Though Martha mentioned he often woke at 3:17 in the morning, sitting bolt upright as if answering a call only he could hear. The mantel clock, which had kept perfect time for 20 years, stopped the day after he woke and refused all attempts at repair. Nora Henley married a merchant from Peoria that December. At the wedding, she danced once with Elias, a strange pairing. The woman who'd read to him through childhood and youth, the man who remained a boy in all but body. Alcott heard her whisper, "I kept my promise. Every day." Elias nodded, though his eyes suggested he remembered none of it, only the ghost of her voice threading through an absence he couldn't name. In his final entry, dated January 15th, 1873, Alcott wrote in his official ledger, "Patient E. Whitmore shows complete recovery from extended catatonic state. No lasting physical impairment observed. Cognitive function adequate for employment and daily activities. Case closed. In his private journal, he wrote something different. Science demands reproducible phenomena. Some mysteries, mercifully, occur but once.